Thank you so much for having me, and thank you for such a lovely introduction. I should clarify, out of my own insecurity, I promise I didn't write that. I'm not a colossal narcissist. I don't just sit there being like, and I've spoken at Oxford, and I've spoken at Harvard, and honestly, the Google talk was actually by accident. Well, they asked me to do a talk, and they asked how much I'd charge them, and I said $3,000, which is my way of communicating "fuck off," but politely. But I forgot that they're Google, and therefore have more money than God. And so their reply was, "Cool, how would the 21st of July work?" And it all got a bit out of hand. But the good news is that I did then get to make a very large donation to a local queer non-profit, and because I'm extremely petty, do so in the name of one of my least favorite sort of arch-conservative professors in my field. Never let it be said that academia is for professionals. So far as I can tell, about 40% of academia is insecure grudge holding and shitposting. So I'm here today to do a talk on AI and othering, a critical disability analysis, which is digging into some of the work that I've been doing over the last year or so and the direction my work has been trending in. You've already heard far too many nice things about me. I'll just say that I'm kind of professionally bad at picking a discipline. My sort of home field is science and technology studies, which I jokingly call the science of science. Basically, I study how scientific researchers and technologists and designers go about theorizing, designing, and building, and the values that end up incorporated into how technology works, or what we think of science as a result of that. And so, these other disciplines I end up kind of sort of weaving in, how gender is reproduced in technology design, or what models of knowledge that scientists depend on for why they think and write in a particular way. And my interest in this is not from some abstract, objective perspective, which would be pretty difficult because a lot of the time I don't really believe that objectivity exists in the way that it's talked about. I'm interested in it because of my ethical and political commitments, which are very broadly construed to a better and freer and less violent world. And technology is one site where violent narratives and outcomes are, exercised and made real. And if anyone is curious as to what exactly, a better and freer world looks like, or what I mean by that, because that could mean a host of things, obviously I would hate to bring politics into the academy, which, as we all know, is entirely neutral. So I will just say that my last full-length paper was a paper on anarcho-communist approaches to human-computer interaction, which somehow got accepted into the field's main publication venue, and the emails I got afterwards were about evenly split between "this is amazing" and "how did you get this accepted?" Which is also how I feel about the paper. So today's sort of overlap of disciplines is pretty much all of the above, aside from gender studies, but it starts with AI ethics, a topic that comes up a lot in the circles I run in. How we go about ensuring that artificial intelligence doesn't wreck the world further. Normative answers to this question, by which I mean both answers that are prescriptive, so normative in the philosophical sense, and answers that are sort of mainstream, so normative in the critical sense, often focus on these three values of fairness, accountability, and transparency. If we have those, we have an ethical system, allegedly. These values are actually so important to the framing of the discipline that they've been adopted as now the name of the main ACN conference on this. And on the surface, they seem pretty uncontroversial. Who doesn't want things to be fair, or accountable, or transparent? Which goes some way to explaining why they've been so widely adopted and used to study, demographic biases from gender to race to class in the systems that people design and deploy. But now I have to do the traditional academic thing of going, it's more complicated than that. There's actually some deep nuance that these people are missing, which might be my least favorite trick in the academy after when you ask someone a question and then they decompose why the question is invalid and therefore they don't have to answer it, which is a really convenient trick for a lot of people to rely on. Unfortunately, sometimes you rely on them because they're the right thing to do. So for example, investigations of fairness frequently center gender and race, but very rarely discuss disability. And by rarely, I mean a paper looked at about 1,500 AI ethics papers and found that 11 even mentioned terms around disability. None of them actually primarily engaged issues of disability and injustice. Plus, even sort of considerations of fairness itself aren't necessarily sufficient, right? Fairness, in the way that AI ethicists think of it, is about making sure that the algorithm that's being designed doesn't produce sort of obvious biases in the outputs. And this is a very narrow and constrained view, one that ignores structural power and injustices, how they can be replicated by long chains of systems, not just an individual algorithm, which might in isolation look neutral. And it ignores the way that systems produce not just material consequences, but also discourses, narratives, ways of knowing, and ways of thinking about things, which can themselves be or justify violence against populations. And to specify, since I'm surrounded by other students, and I'm guessing that there are a non-trivial number of people who spend too much time online and have had our brains baked by, despair and fear and irony. When I say discourse, I don't just mean Twitter jokes, but instead sort of ways of thinking about the world, and specifically and importantly, how the way you think about the world shapes what kind of questions you ask and what kind of answers and methods you can look at. So if you live in a context that treats queer people as, well, not really people, you're unlikely as a scientist to take queer perspectives very seriously. Unlikely as a person to spend particular energy being considerate of them, and also pretty damn unlikely to find yourself on my Hanukkah list, because, this is basic. Discourses are just cultural narratives and ways of thinking that shape how you see, how you interpret what you see, and what you can do about it. And so given these sort of gaps in AI fairness, the fact that it's very rarely examines questions of disability, and the fact that even when it does examine disability, the idea of fairness is itself kind of limited, I decided to specifically try and understand what kind of discourses are replicated through AI systems. Not just the material obvious harms of this algorithm is biased or this algorithm is not biased, but instead this is the premise of the algorithm. And so if we trust this algorithm and if we spread this narrative and justification around in the world, this is what it says about disabled people, and here are some consequences of that. And to do that, I looked specifically at a pair of case studies, broadly concerned, areas. One area of academic research and one sort of company and corporate product, which are specifically focused on autism. And my reason for focusing on autism is threefold. One, I'm autistic, and if the completely monotone vocal pattern had not already clued people off to that, that's fair. Two, sort of critical autism studies and that area of critical disability studies is the area that I'm most sort of familiar with and embedded in. And three, my experience of navigating the academy while autistic had already given me too many obscenity-laced opinions about what normative narratives have to say about autistic personhood, and so it was this nice trifecta of, oh, it's an area that I can speak to, have an academic backing in, and also have really strong incentives to make people in my field take seriously. So the two case studies, one of them is private sector, one of them is public. One of them is a research project, the other is a product. And one treats autism as a subject, and the other treats autistic people as an object of study. So on paper, they're as different as you can imagine, but in practice, what we found was a lot of similarities and overlaps. So the first is Divergent, which is a company that employs autistic people as hand coders, basically the people who annotate machine learning data sets and make them sort of usable and consumable to train algorithms. And Divergent bills itself as solving two problems. The first is the need for sort of high quality data annotation, and the second is the underemployment of autistic people. And so their logic is that by employing autistic people as hand coders, they solve two problems with one, solution. The second is AI for autism diagnosis, or AIAD, which is basically trying to develop algorithms that can detect autism frequently through the analysis of people's movement or like eye focus or communication. Because this is a research area rather than a company, they don't have a fancy logo, so I instead looked through like the Google patents for like, autism diagnosis, like patents that might have interesting or like applicable visualizations. I couldn't find any, so I instead picked these to illustrate it because in or out of context, they are just confusing. But as far as I can tell from the patent, the basic idea is, what if we record videos of autistic people and then watch when they fall over to see if we can detect whether they're autistic by how and when they fall over and how they walk before that. No. Right? And I'm like, I have lots of questions, but I think one of them is, imagine that you are a just like normal, like average human being, like just regular person, not a scientist who claims to be trying to do good for the world, like active as like an active motivation, just like a random human being. And you are watching someone walk towards a rock that you expect them to trip over and fall flat on their face in front of. Do you A, tell them, or B, pull out a camera? Because apparently the answer should be B. In fact, if it's B, you get a doctorate. Anyway, so on the surface, like I said, these areas are very, very different. But I decided to like sort of pick them out because I guess I like the parallels of like, one is about let's make autistic people productive by giving them jobs, and the other is about let's make autistic people productive by making them not autistic. And I basically went through sort of all the research papers, all the news coverage, interviews, like website materials, every possible trace of like how these people are putting themselves out into the world and how they want the public or their colleagues to see their work and to sort of like frame like their understanding of like what this is for, what it does. And it pulled out a ton of like horrifyingly dystopian stuff. Like I could literally write a book with like just a chapter on each of the themes that I found, like how the narratives display like gendered assumptions and biases, racialized assumptions and biases. There is a distressing amount of just like pure like venal capitalism involved. But I decided to focus just in on one because while if I tried to cover all of them, nobody wants to see a book presented. Like, what, 10 minutes on each chapter, I guess? So instead I decided to like focus in on one particular theme, which is how these materials like communicate an understanding of like autistic people's knowledge and the nature of knowledge and sort of the nature of personhood. And the attitude I take when thinking about sort of knowledge and personhood is very heavily informed by feminist epistemology, which is the study of the nature of knowledge from a feminist perspective, that includes attending to what Nancy Tuana says, what kinds of people get to know things that are valid and credible. And as attending to like, questions of who gets to know suggests, when we're talking about knowing things and knowledge, we're usually talking about a social practice and a social process, right? So you don't just know something in isolation. That doesn't mean like that it's knowledge in like a communal sense. What makes it knowledge and what makes you sort of a person who can be relied on to know things is not just to like have that factoid, but to be recognized by others as like capable of knowing things and communicating things that you know and so deserving of like being listened to and being treated as if the things you say are credible. And so in a society that is as strongly oriented around knowledge as ours, I say, as a PhD student, to a load of people who are undergrads, in part because we live in a society where unless you have an official piece of paper written in a dead language communicating that you are trusted to know things, you can't get jobs. You know, knowledge is tied very, very strongly to sort of personhood and social role. If you're not able to know something and not recognized as a knower, you're not really a person at all in most situations under the social frame that we exist in. And as we'll see, for autistic people, this frame is something that sort of collides and clashes with our lives in a lot of ways. So we can start off looking at things by looking at what all these materials say about how AIAD researchers and Divergent employees see autistic knowledge of others, right? The ability to perceive and communicate with the world around you. As this Damien Milton quote nicely summarizes, a pretty consistent idea in popular notions of autism, research into autism, and diagnostic criteria is that autistic people kind of suck at this aspect of life, right? We're seen as less able to understand other people, less able to interpret what people mean, and appropriately and properly communicate things. And the idea comes up time and time again in the IAAD literature, particularly in the research papers where researchers sort of set out like what they mean when they say autism and like why they're concerned, which was very convenient for me because it meant that like the first paragraph of the introduction every single time was like where the good stuff was. But repeatedly we see people emphasizing the idea of autists as like incapable of sociality, with sort of incapable of existing in a community of others and communicating, and you know, the sort of like best quote, using best in scare quotes, was this one where you get the idea of autists as sort of locked into ourselves. And I think it's important to focus in there on the word useful and the implications of that, because what it actually means is that communication that sort of neurotypical people don't care about or don't understand doesn't count as communication at all. So already we can see sort of these problems of like who gets to know things and what does that mean starting to crop up. The same is true in the literature around Divergent, although it's slightly more indirect. The marketing materials, the press releases, the interviews, they all make a big show of how important it is that they train autistic people to be social, to be able to communicate and sort of provide shared social spaces for autistic employees. And so the implication of this is that autistic people can't do these things, right? Like you don't provide the like US Olympics team, like if you provided the like, you know, gymnastics team with like a dedicated social space for like practicing fine motor coordination skills, that would be kind of ludicrous and superfluous because they are literally the best people in the world at, you know, very precise motor movements. And so the implication of, yeah, look, we've got this space for autistic people to like socialize and to learn how to communicate and socialize with other people properly, is that autistic people come out of the box not able to do that. You know, we have to be fixed before we can communicate or interact. And autistic communities, of which there are many, don't count and don't exist, which is kind of shocking to me because I'm part of a lot of them, but according to Divergent and according to the sort of narrative that it puts out, this is like a sort of unique and novel offering of like, look, we're teaching autistic people to communicate with other people. The other downside, by the way, of being me is very British, and so all of my jokes sound serious, and all of my serious statements sound like jokes. So, just to clarify for people, if you hear me say something and you're like, oh my god, that is horrifying, that was a joke. And if you hear me say something and you're like, oh my god, that was brilliant, that was me being serious. And if you apply this heuristic, then I end up happy, you end up happy, everyone does well. So, okay, that's knowledge of others. What about knowledge of self? Like, internal sense of self and understanding of what you're feeling, thinking, knowing who you are as a person, right? So normative frames of autism, whether they are sort of formal and clinical ones or research ones or even just popular culture stories about autistic people, tend to also emphasize this lacking of knowledge of self, lacking of internal personhood. In fact, one of the dominant ideas about autism, which is by Simon Baron-Cohen, who is a tremendous arsehole. He also, by the way, hypothesizes that autism constitutes the extreme male brain, and therefore women with autism don't exist, which is deeply shocking to all the women I know who are autistic, but be that as it may. But he has this big theory, his big idea of what autism is, which is known as the theory of mind framework, which basically says that autistic people lack an internal sense of self, that we can't reflect or have self-knowledge in any meaningful way, that we don't understand ourselves, and the sociality issues and communication issues stem from this lack of internal personhood. If empathizing consists of, for example, simulating how you'd feel if that happened to you, it doesn't really work in a model where you can't perceive what you'd do if something happened to you. And this is the dominant scientific theory of this is what autism is autistic people as basically empty shells. Now, if you're perceived as lacking in self-understanding and lacking the ability to appropriately communicate, then you're consequently going to be perceived as not a reliable source of expertise about autism generally, or your experience of it in particular. Which is one of the reasons why so many ideas of sort of what autism is stem not from autistic people, but from siblings, parents, random researchers, some guy who lives down the street and the paper was one interviewee short for the expectations of the journal, so they were interview Bob who works at the pizza place and just put in his random opinions. Autistic people aren't seen as reliable narrators of our own experiences and lives. And this is really apparent in a lot of the literature. So the divergent people were sort of the pinnacle of this. And I really hope that they somehow see the recording of this talk. Because, I don't know, it would be nice for someone to say something to them. They both have autistic relatives, a brother and a cousin respectively. And in every single interview or news story or video or anything, they always start their story by pointing to the concerns they have about said relatives. But neither of the relatives ever get a voice. They never appear in any of the materials. Instead, the co-founders get to say that they know what autistic people enjoy and want because they have one cousin who is autistic, which is in its own weird way amazing, because if you're a critical scholar, a lot of the time you have to pick through people's statements really finely to work out this subtextual discourse, and then sometimes people are kind enough to just say the quiet thing out loud and your life gets a lot simpler. In fact, one publication, they describe having a cousin who is autistic as first-hand experience of autism. So literally, autistic people don't get to have experiences of autism because autism means autistic people don't experience. The same sort of discounting of self-knowledge comes in the IAD literature. There's a lot of talk about involving stakeholders in how the software is designed. I was very distressed a year into my PhD to find out that stakeholder does not in fact mean an angry mob chasing down a vampire, but instead random people who think they get to have opinions. And there's parents and caregivers and, more importantly, health professionals, but there's never ever a mention of, has anyone considered asking the autistic people how they feel about us building like HAL 9000 and then making it stare at them for 3 hours to decide whether they're special or not. Patients don't actually even get to consent. There was this one study that sought consent and feedback from parents, despite the fact that the study populations included 17 and 18-year-olds. I agree. They're 17, they're 18. They have the right in the country I was born in to join the armed forces, but apparently they don't have the right to sign consent forms because as autistic teenagers, they're not reliable and credible enough to have that extended to them. So if autistic people can't be trusted to know others or know ourselves or communicate knowledge validly, what kind of people are we? And according to a lot of normative theories, we're basically not people. I quote Melanie Yourgao again because she is one of my favorite people in the entire world, and also one of the few academics who gets away with being saltier than I am in papers. Very much thoroughly recommend her stuff. The last piece of hers I read opened with her being institutionalized. But basically influenced by this theory of mind idea mentioned earlier, and along with more general but less formally grounded discourses about autistic people sort of lacking sociality and internal knowledge, a lot of approaches to autism in wider society and in the academy treat autistics as inhuman or subhuman. You can even see this in the popular narratives, right? The ones that are ostensibly positive. The portrayal of Rain Man or similar idiot savant figures, right? People are like, oh, but that's positive because they're a savant, and I'm like, it's negative because they're still typecast, and also the term contains the word idiot, which is, while disability related, rarely used as a positive. Even films like Rain Man still portray autistic people as basically robots. It's just that in this case, it's a robot who's really, really good at this one specific thing. More generally, though, I recently discovered, for example, that autistic people are a classic case study in moral philosophy. There are probably about 100 papers by moral philosophers who use us as a case study to debate the idea of moral agency. When are you no longer enough of a person to be held culpable for immorality? And the case studies they tend to use are autistic people and sociopaths. Those are the two populations they think of as being good for interesting debates about okay, so these people aren't people. Does that mean that they shouldn't be responsible for things? Or and so it's not surprising to see the AI developers who, as we've seen, have taken this approach of discounting autistic knowledge and communication, also discounting autistic people's humanity. Perhaps my favorite specimen was this quote from an interview of the Divergent co-founders. And there's a lot going on here, but I'd just like to really emphasize that last sentence. These folks are the key to making sure that when people come in, they can focus on work. So autistic employees aren't people, and the tasks that we do are not work. These projects may have this sort of ostensibly good intention, albeit in a very paternalistic way, but they're ultimately premised on this idea of autistic people aren't people, and we get to decide what they want, and we get to decide how they should be seen. And the same is true with the sort of AIAD stuff, right? By definition, why are these people interested in autism diagnosis? Because the earlier we diagnose autism, the earlier we can stick them in therapy and fix them. As someone who was diagnosed as a small child, this does not work. So, yeah. So what are the consequences of this sort of narrative discounting of autistic personas? Obviously at one level, it's this small set of actions that kind of reinforces the dominant idea of autists on people in society more broadly, but there are more specific concerns as well. So take Divergent, for example. They're the people who know what autistic people want, and what autistic people want is to work in tech. Tell me, when people think of working in tech, do you think of jobs that pay between $12 and $15 an hour, don't provide pensions, and that describe their health insurance coverage as hopefully starting next year? Because I'm pretty sure that's not what people think of when they think tech jobs. In fact, all of Divergent's autistic employees are contractors, so no tax coverage, no hiring protections, no firing protections, no pension, no anything. Basically, when Divergent says autistic people should get jobs, what they actually mean is autistic people should get a specially branded version of Mechanical Turk. And when autistic employment is oriented around these assumptions of like machinic lack of self and lack of communication, you know, what happens when autistic employees display communication and autonomy? Like, so Divergent pays people between $12 and $15 an hour and assumes that words they come out with aren't real words. You know, what happens if a lot of autistic people who work for them decide to unionize to fix the fact that they're being paid $12 to $15 an hour? Like, can you see like co-founders whose entire business model is autistic people don't understand how to hang out with other people, taking a union of autistic people seriously? Because I can't. And if autists like can't validly know, then whose perspective is going to be foregrounded in the event that you dispute the outcome of a diagnostic algorithm, or you dispute the morality of this research in general? If what we say doesn't count, if what we say can be discounted, then it's hard to say that the answer is going to be the people subject to the system. And there's a bigger issue here as well, which I've sort of brought out a bit. One which illustrates nicely why considering disability and feminist philosophy is so important in AI ethics. So normative ethical frames in AI, like I said, tend to center around fairness and accountability and transparency. All of them look pretty reasonable, and so all of them have ended up, pretty widely used in our idea of like, how should we design systems to be good? But let's look at these things again with that like feminist epistemic turn, right, of thinking about knowledge and personhood and recognition. If you're not recognized, for example, can you be part of a protected group that actually protects you in any meaningful way? And if you're not a member of a protected group, how are you going to get filtered into ideas of like, people who should be considered when we're deciding if an algorithm is fair? If you can't communicate in a valid way, how a company is going to be accountable to you? Like, how can you expect them to be answerable? And if you can't be trusted to understand things, then why would anyone focus on trying to develop systems which are transparent to you, right? And what I'm getting at here is that if algorithmic systems and their designers can design a system which might be fair, might be unfair, whatever, but that is premised on and perpetuates this view of this population lacks personhood, then the harms that result from that can't actually be addressed, because all of the mechanisms for addressing harms require personhood for you to participate. It is analogous to saying that if you want to enter the DMV, you have to have your driver's license. It works fine unless you're there to pick up a driver's license, in which case you're shit out of luck. And so to get... Sorry. That's okay. These are, I think, the slides I wrote at a really late point in the evening a few weeks ago, so they are noticeably more informal, but not inaccurate. In fact, I recently noticed that, so this is also a paper called Automating Autism, because I like alliteratives, and it's currently under review at the Journal of Socio-Technical Critique, which sounds very fancy, but was started 2 months ago. And I submitted it for review, and it's now under review, and then I noticed that I had forgotten to remove the jokey footnote that I'd written at 3 a.m., which just refers to Wittgenstein's unrepentant misogyny, and that's in the version that's being reviewed. So the moral of the story is basically that like I should have other people look at my notes before I display them if I want to sound professional. Or alternatively, the moral of the story is write whatever you want, and if none of the reviewers notice, you can just publish that. But normative AI ethics is very philosophically liberal, which I do not like. But basically it's descended from Kant's perspectives on like personhood and agency, which, to summarize very briefly, is he has this idealized version of like, for people to be people, like you have to be capable of like rational, independent agency and thought, which, as you can imagine, from a guy who also maintained that women weren't people and black people weren't people, tended to be kind of constrained. And even though much of philosophy has moved on to like, you know, doing better than that, or at least not explicitly writing down that women aren't people and black people aren't people, there's still this inheritance of this idea of like independence and like rationality, and unless you are like an island of a human being who thinks very logically and consistently and reasonably by the standards of old white dudes, then you don't count as a person. And disability studies scholars and philosophers of disability and feminist philosophers have been critiquing this idea for a while for pretty obvious reasons, like the fact that there's really no such thing as independence. Like everyone is related to other people. The kinds of relating to other people that we consider non-normative, and so like lead to a discounting of agency, just tends to be the kind that's experienced by people who aren't able-bodied white dudes. And the fact that like we know enough about how the voices of everyone except able-bodied white dudes are discounted to be pretty suspicious of any like universal test for what counts as reasonable or what counts as rational. So my point in this is just that, you know, in a lot of respects, this is actually a very old problem. It's just cropping up in this new domain. And so if we want to like fix it, we can't just say, okay, this is bad. Obviously, we shouldn't be saying that autistic people aren't people. Let's say that autistic people are people, problem solved. Because you're still depending on a view of personhood that like leaves some people out. You've just moved the goalpost slightly. Instead, what we could do is look at the answers that political philosophy and like the philosophy of knowledge have been coming up with. Relational ideas of agency and personhood, which basically say that if everyone is interrelated, then the idea of agency is stemming from like someone being an entire and complete person on their own, taken in isolation, doesn't make any sense. Let's just discount it altogether and start looking at like how people relate to each other, look at recognition as a social practice and like focus on the injustices there. Or a post-humanist idea of agency and personhood, which basically tries to think about agency without specifying a human subject at all. Like it's not that there's a human subject alone or a human subject in a network of relations. It's more like where you draw the line of like, this is the subject and this is the set of relations is itself an ethical act, and you can draw that line in different spaces and like construct different visions of itself. The person responsible for it is Karen Barad, who I will say perfectly honestly, I do not understand and feel really bad for not understanding, because she's obviously brilliant and all of the people I like really like her sort of like post-humanist view of things. I just feel like I'm not smart enough to understand a book on philosophy written by a quantum physicist. Like, it's amazing, but I don't have the hubris to claim I understand what's going on, even if I've read all the works. But regardless of sort of like what we pick, hopefully the sort of takeaway here is that, you know, examining questions of disability and questions of AI shows new nuances in the kinds of harms that matter and that can surface in discussions of AI ethics. It's not just a question of being more inclusive, which is always treated as like, we've just increased the number of people who are considered when we design things. It's also different people with different life experiences and different treatments by societies will surface entirely new questions and concerns and issues with the system you're designing. And doing so shows that normative AI ethics is really not equipped to actually handle challenges to personhood in algorithmic systems. Like, because of how the field thinks about agency, and also because the field doesn't talk about how it thinks about agency, it just kind of assumes that everyone means the same thing when they say agency, in the same way that if you look at like computer science papers that say they're measuring gender, there's never a specification of what they actually mean by that. They're just like, you know, gender, that thing, which means the same thing to me and all of the readers and all of the, like, you know, paper participants. Because the field doesn't actually do this, doesn't critically engage with like how it's thinking about personhood or agency, or even define this is how I'm thinking about it, there's this big loophole in normative AI ethics where basically you can do whatever the hell you want to people with an algorithm, as long as you first make sure to ensure that the people who sort of run the processes for addressing algorithmic harms don't think of that population as people whose emails they have to read or respond to. It's that simple. And so looking at a relational or a post-human base for agency is likely to get us a hell of a lot further than just saying, obviously we should treat autistic people as people, and so let's like explicitly write that into the footnotes. Like, you know, people have to be independent, asterisk, also autistic people. No, we should look at entirely new ways of thinking about this, and we should do so in a way that engages with a lot of the feminist work and a lot of the critical disabilities work that has already been done, rather than trying to reinvent the wheel and like write an entire discipline's worth of papers about fairness, as if like political philosophy hasn't been arguing over what the hell that means since 1956. And yeah, those are sort of the takeaways, I guess, hopefully. And I think that's all I have. I am around for questions, basically, until the Tech for Good people like drag me out by the ear to dinner, and also around for emails and questions and, well, anything broadly construed. Memes, please send me memes. Feel free to send me memes or photos of your pets at that email address, which is okeys@uw.edu. Otherwise, I'm around for Q&A, and thank you again for having me. I hope this means that like everyone has questions and are waiting for someone else to raise their hand first, and not nobody has questions and in fact is supremely bored. But if it's the latter, then when you're throwing like fresh fruit at me, apples are my favorite, followed by, I guess, tomatoes. I'm a grad student, I'm not going to turn down a source of nutrition even if it's high velocity and thrown in my face. No questions? Okay. Oh, yes.
First of all, thank you so much. That was an amazing talk. Second of all, I wanted to kind of go over like that move you were doing towards the post-human. I think like, yeah, I agree with you that like, I swear this won't be a comment, that was no question. I like agree with you that moving towards the post-human, like, and kind of like dismantling the category of the human because it's been tied up with like able-bodiedness and whiteness forever is like really an important move towards moving towards agency and new forms of engagement with computers. However, could you comment more on like what is the power in your mind in like illegibility, like in AI, and like how that can also be power?
Illegibility in like a James C. Scott kind of sense?
Like, yeah, I'm thinking about like things like pattern of life analysis and like how the failure to be understood in the view of AI can actually be like a way to subvert the state.
Absolutely. So let's see. There's kind of several threads there, I guess, in sequence. Yes, moving towards the post-human is totally something that helps. At the same time, it is, for reference, also something that I have a lot of issues with. I've been going through this like existential crisis over the last 6 months, which has basically consisted of what is the value of critique? Do I actually make a damn difference? And part of that has been sort of like thinking kind of seriously about what our methods say about our tactics. And so the post-human has some advantages in that it moves away from that everybody like center and that highly like racialized and also highly unmarked racialized like premise. At the same time, I'll be the first to say that actually I find it kind of a headache because people trying to design a system from a post-human basis are, I think, likely to get headachy and like very frustrated because you kind of can't design a system from a post-human basis. There isn't only one. And the point of a post-human view of things is not in and of itself to say like, let's discount the human entirely and let's just like, everyone read Deleuze and Guattari. Everyone pretend you understood what the hell they were on about. Instead, it's more about taking ethical ownership and responsibility. Like, it's not saying let's never draw that boundary of like inside and outside. Instead, it makes the argument for there is always going to be that boundary. Like, what is required is instead to like explicitly attend to that boundary and like take ethical responsibility for the fact that you drew it and for the consequences of that. And so I think of it less as the building new stuff and more as a sort of like sensitizing frame. Like it's a new tool with it's a new tool with which to look at what you're doing. Illegibility is another tool and another tactic and another way of looking at things, and it is in fact, yeah, it's one I advocate a lot. Mostly very grumpily. I wrote an essay a while back called Counting the Countless, which basically argued that the existence of data science is fundamentally a threat to and inimical to queerness, and that nobody should get involved in it, and we should just exercise a right of refusal and illegibility and damn the whole thing. Which went semi-viral, and the most obvious like consequence of which was like, I made a trans woman who read the essay on Reddit like profoundly depressed, which I still feel bad about, because she was planning on going into data science, and yeah. So I do think illegibility is important and is a tool, and I don't think it's actually counter to a post-human view of things, in a sense of if we treat both of them as like ways of approaching problems and as fundamentally like relative and relational and like contextually bound things, then it is possible to do both in different circumstances and adapt depending on, you know, depending on whether you think that changing the premise of the system will do enough good in the short term to make up for it perpetuating the system, or whether refusing to participate in the system is the right way to go. Like, I don't advocate one over the other, more I advocate like being able to deploy both and being able to like examine something through both sets of lenses so that you can pick and choose like which one makes sense with one set of circumstances. Yes?
I was kind of, so like, going off of what you just mentioned, the Counting the Countless paper, I feel like I've met a lot of people and had like, and have a lot, like for a long time been one of those people who was looking for a way for tech to somehow like promote justice and like get us toward a more liberated world. And I think like I've also met a lot of people now, and now I'm someone who's like not really sure that's like even possible. But I guess I was wondering if you could talk about whether you feel like there is any like any possibility of that at all.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that there is. 2 years ago, I would have said that the most efficient way to like, you know, improve the outcome of society is that every time like sort of a reverse minyan, I guess. Every time 10 or more machine learning people get in a room together, we get to take their laptops away and they're not allowed online ever again. Like, but more broadly, what I say is like, technology is a technology. It's a technique. It's a way of doing things, or a set of ways of doing things. And you get technologies that are biased in one direction or another, but it's very rare to find one that could only be used for bad things. And the question of do we engage or not, or how do we engage? Like, can we use technology for good? I think the answer is actually yes. It's just something that's not going to come through our normal ideas of like what it means to make technology or what technology is. So the two things I'd really recommend for anyone who's like also struggling with this question, and I frame it that way to be clear that I am still struggling with this question. Like that, I don't have a good, perfect answer. In fact, I wouldn't trust anyone who claimed they did. Is an essay by Philip Agre, A-G-R-E, which is just called Lessons Learned from Attempts to Reform AI. So Agre was an absolute nutbar, and I say that as someone who is also an absolute nutbar and who is his like grand advisee, I guess. He basically founded all of modern AI. Like his PhD thesis was the basis of new AI, like the idea of like algorithms that like learn through encounters with the world, as opposed to what if we build a single ontology that contains literally every factoid and how they relate, and then put it in a computer, and then we'll have AI. That was his PhD. And then he moved to San Francisco, read Bourdieu, and lost his mind. And he ended up a social computing professor at UC Irving. And so he writes this essay from the perspective of someone who like comes from this very strong AI background. Like he did his PhD at the AI lab at MIT, but also is like really heavily embedded in like theory and like methods of critique. And he argues for what he calls a critical technical practice, which is having one foot in the language of critique and one foot in the practice of design. Because if we try and make the world better just by thinking about making the world better, then we're going to lack a lot of the tools and a lot of the language for like critiquing the framework of technology and like how we think of it. But if we root ourselves entirely in critique, then we're going to show up to some algorithmic designers and be like, aha, Lacan and his psychoanalytic theories of society prove that your algorithm is bad. And the response is going to be, that's not what our algorithm does, or how it works. It would help if you had ever used it. And then the other work that I've found like very, very useful for thinking about this is a book by Carl DeSalvo, which is called Adversarial Design, and basically advocates an agonistic approach to like the role of technology in society and the role of like technology in politics. Where he basically says, look, there are very rarely going to be clean answers. Like the question of how do we design technology to promote outcomes should in part be designing technology to like make that debate and fight of different perspectives and different views something that people can enter on a more level playing field. No problem. Was that a hand or a please stop talking, you're boring?
It was a half hand.
Okay.
So it's a half question. I didn't plan on it. When you spoke about translating or there being possibilities in post-human or other, critical theory informed conceptions of agency, you might have already started answering this question, but I was wondering what paradigms of human-centered design or design in general seems to be an appropriate stage for a translation of those theories into what it means to make accessible technology.
That is a really good question, and it is one I am still seeking an answer to because for people who haven't worked in human-computer interaction, last year they published a paper that said that maybe it'd be good to read philosophy sometime, and also a book suggesting that it might be useful if computer scientists had read critical theory, at all. But at the same time, the field does have, and this is the perverse thing, really deep, roots in certain kinds of politics. So computer-supported collaborative work, the conference, and also the subdiscipline. Anyone here familiar with it? Did you know it was founded by Marxists? Hardcore Marxists? The reason that CSCW and participatory design are what they are is because they were founded by Scandinavian communists. The point of participatory design is literally seizing the means of production. That was the point. So the weird thing about HCI is there are a lot of subdisciplines that have very radical roots. But a lot of the like design philosophies that have come out don't. You get things like, you know, Don Norman's work, which so far as I can tell consists of misinterpreting what a psychologist said, publishing a best-selling book based on what you want the psychologist to have said, and then founding a company that does this whole method of like inclusive great design, which includes in its like standard textbook of this is what this method looks like, a case study of redesigning ICE checkpoints to be more user-friendly and less intimidating. He's also apparently a terrible human being. Like he's one of those professors who likes like showing up at PhD defenses just to ask deliberately hard questions and see if he can make the candidate cry. Not one of my faves. But yeah, a lot of the design that comes out of HCI has been very conventional, and one of the reasons that I like Carl's work is that it does take this more radical like approach. And that, I think, is sort of the answer, like looking at stuff that is rooted in more of the sort of critical computing literature. So Chris Ledontek's stuff and his PhD, now graduated PhD student, Dr. Mario Massad, who, like they're down at Georgia Tech. Mario managed to introduce the term prefiguration into HCI without anyone noticing, which anyone who doesn't know, prefiguration is the idea that like, if you're trying to achieve nice outcomes, you should maybe be nice in how you do it. It originates in anarchist theory, and she made them think it was a design term. She's my fave. And also the work that Lily Irani and other people at the University of California, San Diego have been doing to bring in sort of like post-colonial and explicitly anti-capitalist perspectives in like how they frame technologies. So one of their famous projects, for example, is Turkopticon, which is basically this idea of turning like mechanical Turk like user ratings back on the sort of client and creating community spaces for mechanical Turk users that allow for like shared and distributed knowledge of which people don't pay you and which people aren't worth working for, and you know, an exchange of information and advice. She is one of my absolute faves, and the approach that she takes to this, I think, is really nicely done. But in terms of like, you know, big brand name design theories, honestly, there aren't any of them that I would particularly point to, except maybe sort of like critical action research and like the more radical kind of participatory design. Not the kind that's like, we involved both managers and their employees. But generally speaking, I think that you're probably not going to find anything that bills itself like the blank design theory being that radical, primarily because the kind of person who like claims ownership over a particular theory of everything about design, like there's at least 2 points in that statement where they've already demonstrated that they're probably not thinking critically about what they're doing and like how they're positioned. I'm a cynic. I invite design theorists to prove me wrong, but they haven't yet.
How about, let's do one last question.
So I'm a senior and a computer science major, and I'm going to be entering an environment with a lot of tech people in the near future. Do you have any practical advice for things that I might do to try to contribute to a better world within that environment?
Absolutely, although that's not where I would start. I would start with, here are some heuristics for the kind of companies you don't want to work for, which is basically, does the company actually have a like code of employee behavior? If so, is it largely centered around the idea of free speech? If the answers to those two things are yes, unlikely to be fun, avoid it. Similarly, if the HR department is one person, also avoid it. I learned both of these lessons the hard way, do not recommend. In terms of like things you can do from inside the company, yeah, like that's an interesting one, because I worked in tech for like 5 years before I came back to academia, and a lot of the times it felt like there really was no way to make forward progress, but I don't think that that's true. I think it's more that tech is such a hyper-individualized field that a lot of the advice people have is always going to be focused on like, here are things you should do to make like the world better. And like the actual advice I'd give is form community, like inside the company. Like find people who agree with your concerns or who might agree with your concerns and clearly like actually care, and like keep in touch with them and form community and talk and like meet and hang out and provide like a shared support network for two reasons. The first of which is, like in most companies, individual software engineers particularly, but individual people in general are never going to be able to make substantive change because that's not how organizations work, particularly large ones. And so having a collective of people who can speak with one voice or speak with multiple voices and give like a demonstration of like consensus and a shared view is very powerful. But also because the experience of being inside companies and of trying to make change and trying to like reconcile inside yourself like your moral fight, like the war with yourself about whether this action, this is the one, this is the selling out from which there is no like point of return, or like alternately like this action, this is the one that gets me fired and there's so much more I could have done to like make the place better if I hadn't. Like those are hard things to go through. Whether the company is like Google and is trying to like, you know, build weaponized drones, or whether the company is like some random startup that is just screwing over everyone in like the country on like how their like tax statements are filled out. You're always going to run into ethical questions, and when you do, like having that community is not only a tremendous tool for pushing back and for fighting, but also a tremendous tool for surviving the experience. And you don't have a, you know, your duty to self should not like overtake your duty to others. Like self-interest is not, in isolation, is bad, but you also can't discount it. And yeah, so the advice I give is not do these 5 things to the technology or with the technology or in your interactions with your bosses. Form community, because solidarity is what's going to get us through like the current moment, not, you know, triumphant last stands and like dying on hills. It's nice to die on hills. It's even better to like live with 10 friends and like knock it down.
Can we all thank our keys again?
And thank you again for having me, and I am so sorry that I don't have like 2-word answers to any of these questions. So if there's anyone who like had questions or like thinks of follow-up questions, like please do reach out. I am uniformly available. Like, if you're worried your question is like silly or like pointless or like whatever, you should see some of the stuff that like faculty in my department sent me. You're doing fine. Like, you're not asking me to like guest lecture for free at 7 in the evening to 300 people next week, so you're great.